In your opening statement, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and attention this week. I want to thank you in advance. We expect to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that on November the 26th of 2016, Joel Michael Guy Sr. was viciously attacked in his home in the exercise room that he had upstairs. During this assault, he sustained 42 sharp force injuries. You're going to hear proof from the medical examiner and from a forensic anthropologist about these injuries. And what you're going to hear is that these injuries were so severe that marks were left on his ribs, 12 of his ribs, marks ranging from scratches to complete severing. The medical examiner is going to tell you that the cause of his death was multiple sharp force injuries that caused damage to his lungs, to his liver, and to his kidneys. He sustained a wound to his scapula, which is where your shoulder is, and it was such a severe wound that a fragment from a blunt force instrument was left in the muscular tissue next to the bone. He sustained abdominal wounds, so he was attacked from the front as well as the back. You're going to hear testimony that most of the stab wounds you're going to hear blood staining evidence in this exercise room that indicated that there was a fierce struggle. In one corner of the room, there is blood evidence to show that there was thrashing motion. It left not only blood marks, but wipe marks and droplets on two walls of the room, and extensive blood staining on the carpet. You will hear that he sustained defensive injuries on both of his hands, which indicate that he was fighting and he fought for his life. And his hands were sliced. And you're going to see photographs and hear testimony about the nature and the extent of these injuries. After he was murdered, the killer disrobed him, meticulously took off his clothes, his shoes, his pants, his shirt and jacket, left them in a heap on the carpet. He left Joel Sr.'s cigarettes on top of the pile, and they were blood-stained. He left his hands in the room. At some point, Lisa Guy came home, and she too was subjected to a violent assault. And you're going to hear testimony and see proof of her injuries. She was stabbed 31 times, and she sustained serious injuries to her ribs. She had 21 rib injuries. 21. 9 of her ribs were severed. And you will hear a forensic anthropologist talk to you about the variation of the injuries to her ribs, indicating not just slice marks, scratches, severing, but also evidence that the sharp instrument used to stab her twisted into the cartilage of her ribs. She had one rib that was fractured from blunt force trauma, not sharp force, but blunt force, indicating that there was pressure applied to her ribs. And you will hear that most of these injuries occurred to her back. She had one injury to her clavicle and a stab wound, and she had several stab wounds to her buttock. You will hear testimony that there was evidence in the upper hall at the top of the stairwell from the bottom floor to the top floor that indicates that this is where her murder took place. Blood staining on the walls, drip marks, marks that indicate a spray, perhaps. And like Joel Sr., her clothes were removed from her. They were cut off and left in a bloody pile on top of a large blood stain on the carpet. You will hear that the scissors were found there, along with a knife. You will hear that there were also 2 knives left in the exercise room. So at some point, after Joel Sr. and Lisa were murdered, the killer went to work on their bodies. Joel Sr.'s arms, both of them, were severed at the joint, the shoulder blade. Both of his legs were removed at the hip. His right foot was removed at the ankle. And as you know, his hands, of course, were also removed at the wrist. Lisa had both of her arms removed from her torso at the shoulder. Both of her legs were cut off below the knee. Her right hand was severed from her arm. And the killer cut off her head. You will hear testimony from a forensic anthropologist who will tell you that her head was basically broken from a part of the spine called the atlas. There was a blunt force trauma applied to her neck before her head was severed from her spine. After the limbs of these people were removed, the killer placed them separately into 2 45-gallon blue Sterlite containers. You will hear testimony and see evidence of where that took place. And you will learn that in the master bedroom of their home, plastic sheeting was placed on the floor, and these blue plastic bins were placed on the sheeting. The killer put Lisa's body parts in one, and he put Joel Sr.'s in the other. And then he covered them with a corrosive substance and left them there to liquefy into some sort of diabolical stew of human remains. And then the killer took Lisa's head and carried it downstairs and took it into the kitchen. He got out a stock pot, placed her head in the pot, filled it with liquid, carried it over to the stove, covered it, turned on the stove, and left it there to cook.